But at any rate, take away all that, and that's just a field. And there are tens of thousands of people down here. They've been waiting for Jesus. And there are many people down there who walked in lame and have now broken that crutch over their knee. There are people who are blind who can now see. So you imagine the excitement. By the way, Jesus healed everybody who came to him. He didn't put some sort of a faithometer on your head to see if you had enough faith. That had nothing to do with it. If you got to him, he healed you. Now imagine what that meant for crowd control. Constantly. That's why I like that picture of the woman. Did you get that? The touch of the hem of his garment and so on. That's desperation. But all right. So here you have this crowd of people, and by the time this happens, you are pretty well into the Galilean ministry. So this is what the point I want you to get. What happens out here is this. And I got to tell you, that curved hillside that we can no longer see. Now I'm going to ask our boat captain, I don't know if he'll have time, to make a little bits of a swing north here and see if we can see it from the lake, because you really can't see it except from the lake. But it's just a curved hillside beneath this church. The church wasn't here, but nothing up here has anything to do with Matthew 5:7. It's that field down there and that curved hillside, because if a person stands about halfway up the hillside, not at the top, because then his voice just carries off, but if he stands up about halfway, that hill becomes a sounding board. And it reflects his voice in. Now this is an oral culture, they know how to listen. But the fact is that they've done acoustical tests, and I just tell people, there's a tree, not this one, but this one over here, and I always used to use it kind of as a marker, and I would send the students out, and they would scatter all across that field, and then I would stand there about halfway up the hill, and let me do this. I would affect this voice. Now I'm deliberately pushing my voice out of my, I'm projecting, but I'm not straining, I'm not working, and I would use that voice, and everybody could hear me like I was standing next to them. I'm not kidding. It's amazing. This is an oral culture. They knew where these places were. It's very close to Capernaum. So I think there's every reason to believe that it was probably low on this hillside. Now here's an interesting thing. Be quick, Bookman. In Matthew, it says that he looked on the multitude of sheep without shepherd, and he went up on a hillside. Well, what it says, he went up on a mount. Okay, he went up on a little hill. And he called his disciples to him and began to teach them, saying. All right, now, in Luke, which I think is parallel, it says he taught the multitude. So people say, well, was he teaching the disciples? Understand this, it's huge, all throughout Jesus' life. The most respected man in a community, a Jewish community, is the rabbi, the teacher. How do you come to be a rabbi? There's only one way.
Students.
Pupils. You got to have students. Now, normally rabbis would be itinerary. That's not what I want. Itinerant. And you would travel around with your students because your students would work by day. That was the whole arrangement. So you go where the crops are, and they get a job in the harvest fields, and they get their day's pay. But then in the middle of the day when you rest, and in the evenings you sit, you find yourself a spot, and actually the teacher would sit on a rock, and the students would sit around him on the ground and listen, and it was called powdering yourself in the dust of the rabbi's feet. Now, the point is that if you want to flash your rabbinical union card, you spread your disciples at your feet, honestly. That's what's going on. Jesus comes up, he calls his disciples. Once those disciples, as it were, assume the posture, then everybody down here says, shh, 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 the rabbi's going to teach. And Jesus begins to teach. Now, it says he began to teach his disciples, but that's just the posture. At the end of the sermon in Matthew 7, it says that when he finished all these things, the multitudes were amazed because he taught them as one having authority and not like the scribes. Remember that? So clearly he's teaching the multitude. All right, now let's talk about the sermon. Everybody who studies the Sermon on the Mount thinks he understands it better than anybody else, and I'm no exception, okay? But let me just say, and honest to goodness, when you study the life of Jesus, before you ask what does this mean, matter of fact, I always tell people, when you sit down to read the Bible, If you ask yourself going in, what does this mean to me? Shame on you. First of all, you ask, what does it mean? And that's a function of what the original author meant to say to the original audience, right? Now, once you figure that out, if you get up without asking yourself, what does it mean to me? Shame on you again. But you start out by, what does it mean? So what was Jesus, this is not the Constitution of the Kingdom and all that stuff. What was Jesus doing on that afternoon? All right, in your notes, on one of those important insights, as I call it, I say that Jesus had a remarkable strategy to challenge what seems to be a willingness to follow him. And I mentioned before, he would, I like to say, he put his finger square on the most sensitive spiritual nerve in your body. Do you get to heaven by selling everything you have and giving it to the poor? Of course not. Is that a universal command? Do you find that in Scripture? No. What's going on that day? Man comes to him and says, I want to follow you. I want to give you my allegiance. I'm going to accept you as my Lord and Master. Jesus can look at him. Jesus was the most blindingly intuitive man. Absent any omniscience, he was. He knew, he had a mind that was uncluttered by sin, and he knew the Scriptures. And I think you and I could look at this man and see what's important. So Jesus puts his finger on that nerve and says, all right, sell everything you have. Well, maybe not. Remember the Nazarenes? They hated the Gentiles. So as soon as they sound like they're going to follow him, he says, you know, God still loves the Gentiles. I want to throw them off a cliff. All right, the handiest way he could do this, and it's important, he could challenge what seemed to be a willingness to follow him, was to simply say, you got to choose to the common man. It's me or the Pharisees. The Pharisees were universally revered. They weren't just respected, they were revered. And they were also feared because they could put you apo synagogue. Remember that? John 9, the man born blind, he put him out of the city. That's a fearsome thing. So here we are. What's Jesus doing? And by the way, Jesus never had a problem getting crowds. What do you think? He's the best show in town. He'll heal your sick people if you can get them to him. So everywhere he's go, he's got. So let's look out here. And I'm going to appeal to this one more before we're done. But out here in this field are tens of thousands of people. They're all excited. They seem entirely willing to follow Jesus. And Jesus realizes he's got to put that to the test. So he comes up on his hillside, puts his disciples at his feet, and he begins to teach. Now he starts with the Beatitudes. And they're not Hallmark cards, for heaven's sake. This is, I think, a distillation of the Old Testament ethic. But then he says this, don't you be thinking that I came to destroy the law. Who says that he came to destroy the law? The Pharisees. Because the law is not going to pass away. But then he says this, and I want you to try and catch this, and to make it make any sense, I think you should picture a great multitude of people out there, Jesus on this hillside, but maybe over here in the corner, there's a little gaggle of guys. Their blue is bluer, their fringe is longer, their turbans are higher. You can see them a mile off. These are the Pharisees. And they are already upset with Jesus. But the Pharisees teach, look, the Pharisees, the rabbis, believed in the grace of God. They make much of the grace of God. But I will argue what they meant by that was God is so gracious he gave us the law. And all we have to do is keep the law and we'll be in the kingdom. And the more carefully we keep the law, the better off we are, better chance we have. And I'm going to give my whole life to doing nothing but law keeping, and I'll do it on your behalf. So I'll help you get into the kingdom. This is why they were so happy to watch them give their alms and so on, the common man. So I come back to it. Here you have these Pharisees. They are the heroes of the people. They are the spiritual leaders of the people. And Jesus stands on this hillside, and he says this, and I like to think of him pointing. So there they are, sitting over there, standing over there, a little gaggle, and Jesus says this to the multitude, unless your righteousness exceed that of the scribes and Pharisees, you'll never see the kingdom of God. Folks, a gasp would have gone up from that crowd. You know, the Pharisees like to greet one another as, they would say, good morning, fellow gatekeeper, because they thought that they were so knowledgeable of the law. Not only were they certain to get into the kingdom, but God was going to appoint them to stand at the gate and decide who else got in. And now he says, unless your righteousness exceeds the scribes, and I like to see him pointing, Now the whole rest of the sermon, they say unto you, pointing, they say unto you, not the Old Testament. Jesus never put any distance between himself and the Old Testament. Everything he says is right out of the Old Testament. They say unto you, if you, thou shalt not commit adultery, I say unto you, if you look upon a woman to lust. Who said that first? Who said, if I made a covenant with my eyes, and if I look upon a woman? Job, for heaven's sake. It's not something new. All he is doing, Jesus, is embracing an Old Testament ethic, the ethic of the Scriptures, and saying, they say unto you, but I say unto you. They say unto you, yeah, love your neighbor, but you can hate your enemy. Where's that in the Bible, for heaven's sake? Love, and so, the whole sermon is this. They say unto you, but I say unto you. And it winds up this way. And I like to see him pointing. There's a broad way, leads straight to destruction. Many there are, or there's a narrow way. You can build your house on the sand, or you can build your house on a rock. What he's doing is driving these people to a tough decision. Am I going to embrace this one who claims to be my only hope of redemption, my only hope of salvation, who claims to be the fulfillment of the Genesis 3 passage, which is pivotal and seminal to the whole messianic concept? Am I going to really give him my allegiance? Because if I do, it's going to cost me something. Those Pharisees can make life tough for me. Or am I going to follow the Pharisees? That makes sense to you? Now that's what happens again and again in Jesus' ministry. And I think very dramatically here. And I'm going to say it one more time. It's so dramatic in my mind, so significant, that Matthew parks it right at the beginning of his telling. So if you want to, if there's one story that you got to take and plop over the entire ministry that I'm calling public presentation, just where Jesus again and again, he's not going to have trouble getting crowds. And I'll tell you something. Those crowds are important because, number one, they tie the hands of his enemies. Early on, his enemies wanted to take him, but they couldn't because they feared the multitude. Again and again, the Bible says that. It also totally confused his disciples. His crowds just get bigger and bigger. So when he takes them off to a place called regions of Caesarea Philippi and says, I'm going to die, what are you talking about? You know, you're the idol of everywhere we go. We go into Gentile places. And you got to feed 4,000 Gentiles, for heaven's sake. So it seems for all the world that he's on a roll. But the fact is, Jesus understands. As a matter of fact, he says to him on the way up to Caesarea Philippi, remember this? Beware the leaven of the scribes and basically it's a couple of gospels, but of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. What's that mean? To the disciples, you got these huge crowds. Okay, the Pharisees are upset with you, who cares? But boy, the people love you. Beware the leaven. It's going to work its way through the whole loaf. And the time's going to come where this generation is going to cry out, give us Barabbas. That makes sense to you? But again and again, Jesus drives them to that sort of a decision. All right? That makes sense to you? So the Sermon on the Mount, very important. I think it happens right here. Church is not much help, but pardon? It draws a crowd. It's a big thing, but that's all fine and good. I'm glad they at least keep this for us. But all right, let's head for the bus.